years ago, I used to work with a production director of an Australian company who was fond of saying, "Never let the truth stand in the way of a good story." And when it comes to the interpretation of Matthew chapter 2, there's a sense in which the truth has been lost for the sake of a good story. The story of the Magi in Matthew 2 is often portrayed as the story of three men travelling in search of the Messiah and finding him in the person of Jesus. Three men embarking on a journey of faith from which they return as committed followers of Jesus. And I think that is a great story, because many people spend their whole lives searching for some meaning to them, but never find it, because they somehow overlook the child in the manger. And of course we want people to respond to Jesus by putting their faith in him. The problem is that in order to understand the visit of the Magi in that way, we have to read into it that which is simply not there. And in the process we miss the real point that Matthew is trying to make by including this story in the first place. So if you've got your Bibles with you this morning, you might like to turn to Matthew chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 1 to 12. So that's Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly, and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. There's no doubt that there are a lot of popular myths surrounding the nativity story. Partly this is because the Gospel writers Matthew and Luke leave out quite a lot of details, and many people over the years have felt the need to fill in some of the blanks. This is particularly the case when it comes to the visit of the Magi. For example, Matthew doesn't tell us how many wise men there actually were, and what I find interesting is that in the earliest church tradition there were thought to be 12, and it's only the later tradition that has limited the number to 3 to correspond with the number of gifts that were presented. And so over the years people have embellished it further by inventing names and identities to these 3 men, and the truth is, we know absolutely nothing about them. We are told that they came from the east. Exactly where they came from and how far they had travelled, again we don't know. They followed a star, believing that it heralded the birth of a new king, but as Gentiles they knew very little about the Hebrew Scriptures. So much so that they had to go to Jerusalem to ask for information, which got the immediate attention of Herod and put the whole city in a panic. It's hardly surprising that the whole of Jerusalem was disturbed, since Herod was a man who in the course of his reign killed over 8 members of his own family simply because he suspected that they might be after his throne. When the Magi arrived in Bethlehem, the fact that they found Jesus and his family in a house suggests that this visit took place sometime after Jesus' birth. There is no suggestion by either Matthew or Luke that the Magi turned up at the same time as the shepherds, as is often portrayed in many nativity plays. Certainly they recognised the importance of the child because they worshipped him, but if you compare Matthew 2 with Luke 2, there is none of the sense of excitement and celebration and joy that was experienced during the visit of the shepherds. No choirs of angels. It was a much more subdued affair. And verse 12 ends the passage rather abruptly, and it's at this point that I always feel that there's a sense of anticlimax that kicks in that after they found him, they open their treasures and they hand over the gifts that they have brought, and then they simply go home again. would love to know what happened to the Magi from this point. I would love to know what lasting impact did seeing Jesus have on them, if any at all. There is a huge problem when you deconstruct the myth from the reality. In this case, the response of the Magi to their encounter with the Christ child seems inadequate, and there is not enough there to capture our imagination and inspire us to emulate. That this seems to be an unsatisfactory ending has been shared by many over the years, because again it's here that the legends and the myths take over. But the fact is, we don't know what happened to them after they returned home, because it's not the impact on the lives of the Magi that is important to Matthew in the telling of this story. What is significant about the visit to Matthew is that where it sits in relation to the Old Testament prophets that are confirmed by it. You see, in Matthew chapter 2, no fewer than 4 separate prophecies by Micah, Hosea, Jeremiah and Isaiah are fulfilled through the events that surrounded the visit of the Magi. The visit of the Magi establishes for Matthew conclusive proof that Jesus was the one that had been spoken about by the Old Testament prophets. Right here at the start of Jesus' life is confirmation that he was the one that they had all been waiting for. Sure, there's no doubt that the Nativity story captures the majesty and the significance of the birth of Jesus, but at the end of it, the shepherds have gone home, the Magi head back to where they came from, Joseph, his wife and newborn baby head off to Egypt as refugees. If that was where the story ended, we might be tempted to think, well, that was interesting, but so what? I wonder how many people this Christmas witnessed the Nativity and saw a baby lying in a manger and went home again without giving him so much as a second thought. So what might a better response be to the child in the manger? Of course, we have an advantage that the Magi did not have. We know how the rest of the story unfolds. We know that Christ doesn't stay in the manger. We know that as a child, Jesus grew up into a man, and God's grace was upon him. As a man, his authority was demonstrated through the miracles he performed throughout his ministry. His sacrificial love for us is shown in his dying on the cross, and the power of God is demonstrated through his resurrection from the grave. So unlike the Magi, we are able to see beyond Matthew 2, through the rest of the Gospel, into the post-Calvary, post-Pentecost world of the Apostles. And it's this where, for me, Paul's words in Philippians 3 come in. Because for me, the enduring significance of the child in the manger, lying in the shadow of the cross, is firstly the realization that nothing compares to the greatness and the significance of knowing Jesus. The events that surrounded the Magi's visit to Bethlehem confirms that Jesus is exactly who he said he was. And there's no one else like him. And secondly, our response should not only be to worship him, as indeed the Magi and the shepherds did, but to dedicate our lives in service to him. You see, for Paul in Philippians 3, finding Jesus one of the most significant and important things that had ever happened to him. So much so that everything that he had attained in his life before Jesus took hold of him, he came to consider as completely worthless, fit only to be thrown out with the rest of the rubbish. He realized that when Jesus took hold of him, it was for a purpose, and so he was convinced to leave everything that was in the past behind him and press forward, keeping his eyes focused on the prize. There's a wonderful expression that Paul uses in Philippians 3 where he talks about straining forward. And notice he doesn't talk about drifting forward or going with the flow, but straining forward. Paul knows that it's never going to be easy to follow Christ, and there are times when it's challenging and definitely a strain. At the time that he wrote these words, Paul was in prison under threat of execution. But his motivation to serve the Lord was not diminished, not one bit. We know from Paul's letters that there were times when he despaired, and I wonder if he was ever tempted to contemplate taking a different path to the one God called him to. If he had, he would have been in good company. You remember Jonah's reaction when God told him to go to Nineveh? He ran off in the opposite direction. The desire to run away and hide is natural. Even Jeremiah thought about it. Jeremiah was called by God to what looks like a pretty tough and thankless job, and there's a wonderful verse in Jeremiah 9 verse 2, where he says, "Oh, that I had in the desert a lodging place for travellers, so that I might leave my people and go away from them." In other words, he wished that God had called him to look after a bed and breakfast in the middle of nowhere, rather than the task to which he had called him. This is why Paul tells us that we have to strain forward, because sometimes it's like trying to push a car uphill. You ever broken down at the side of the road? It's easier to find people to push you downhill than to push you uphill. But Paul was able to do that. He was able to strain forward because he was focused on the prize. God had set him on a path from which he refused to be distracted. You know, we sometimes miss great opportunities of life because we get sidetracked. The story is told of a prize bloodhound that started a hunt by chasing a full-grown Highland stag. During the chase, a fox crossed his path, so he began to chase the fox. After a while, a rabbit crossed his hunting path, so he began to chase the rabbit. Chasing the rabbit for a while, a field mouse crossed his path, and he chased the mouse into the corner of the barn. The bloodhound had begun the hunt chasing a prize stag for his master, and wound up barking at a tiny little mouse. The Apostle Paul knew his number one priority in life was to live his life to the honour and glory of God by preaching the gospel, and he wouldn't allow anything to cross his path that would deter him from this priority. We may not all be called to the same ministry as Paul, but we can all play our part. Shane Claiborne puts it, it's not about doing great deeds, it's about doing small deeds with great love. And so as we look back at the Christmas that has gone by, we can either look back at the child in the manger and then, like the Magi, simply go home and not give him another thought for another 12 months. Or we can recognise, like Paul, that knowing Jesus is the most important thing in our lives, and dedicate ourselves anew to serving him with all our hearts and our minds and our strength, putting behind us what is past but straining forward to the prize. Let us pray.